So a few years back, I received an email revealing a 100-year-old family secret. And you know what happens to a secret when it gets shared? It becomes gossip, okay? So growing up, I was told that my ancestors came from France, Ireland, England, Scotland, Sweden, and Norway. You know, generic white guy. And that wasn't quite accurate. So back to the email. Just before the big email, prior to that, I was part of a family thread email where Lorna, cousin on my dad's side, genius family researcher, was sharing all kinds of cool stuff. Fascinated by one little thing, I wrote her personally and asked her a question. She wrote me back and graciously answered, and she said, but you know, what I find really fascinating is that your grandfather's family back in New Orleans prior to 1910 are all listed as black in the US Census records. To which I responded, really? I've never heard that before. Tell me more. And I'm thinking, what in the hell? Like, how come I'm not in on this? Who else in my family knows this? And so I get a little more information from her, but then I go to my sister, who's like super smart, and Anne is a librarian, so she's basically a professional researcher, and she's totally fascinated by this thing. And she works with Lorna and gets on Ancestry.com. No, this is not a plug. And links up with her records, and sure enough, there we find, in short order, my grandfather, his 9 siblings, their parents, and they're all listed ages, birth orders, names, exactly as our family records say. It is our family without a doubt. And sure enough, the US Census records for decades have them listed as black. Occasionally, they're listed with a designation of mixed race, using a word that I won't say here. And so, in 1910, though, records indicate that they've all moved across town and they're now white. And they have chosen to pass as white for reasons that I am in no position to judge. 3 years later, in 1913, probably sick of the gossip and the racism, the entire family up and moves to San Francisco and starts a thriving jewelry business in the Mission. And their secret stays hidden for 100 years. Now, I knew my grandfather and his sister, my Aunt Eleanor, and they didn't particularly have any features that would suggest African ancestry. And from photos, neither did their parents, who my dad called grand-mère and grand-père. They spoke French, they were devout Catholics, and the story was that they were from France but had briefly passed through New Orleans. Yeah, right, briefly passed through. So, armed with this information, I go to my dad and I call him up and we chit-chat a little bit and I say, Dad, wasn't that email from Lorna with all that family history, wasn't that really cool? By any chance, did she share anything else with you that maybe you haven't shared with me? And so he comes clean. Turns out just a few weeks earlier, he had received the same little nugget of information about the census records. And he and his sister, they're in their 80s. They're dumbstruck. They're kind of freaked out. Like, what's up with this? You know, I think they felt like, who's kept secrets from us? They didn't know. Well, we show my dad all of this information, and he becomes as fascinated as we are, albeit still, you know, a little bit weirded out. So lots of research later, including genetic analysis, and it's clear that they were light-skinned French-African Creole who weren't just passing through New Orleans, they had a long, deep history there. Eventually, working with an expert archivist and expert in Creole family history at the New Orleans Public Library, we make an amazing discovery. On November 25th, 1831, records show that my great-great-great-grandfather, Pierre Aubert, petitioned for the emancipation of his slave, my great-great-great-grandmother, Celestine, and their 6-month-old child, my great-great-grandfather, Auguste. Wow. So I've wondered about this. What does this all mean to me here in the 21st century? All of this history from decades and decades ago. And while I have great pride for the tenacity and the persistence of my slave ancestors. I don't for 1 minute pretend that I had to live through or be affected by the legacy of slavery in this country, unlike the vast majority of descendants of slaves. It's like my own private object lesson in white privilege. And while I have that connection, I wonder about my ancestors who owned slaves. If I am going to pay homage to my slave ancestors, then I have an obligation to acknowledge my ancestors who enslaved others. And that's a bitter pill to swallow. That's tough. But when I take a breath and I step back and I look at the whole picture, I become fascinated by all of these ancestors I'll never know. I want to know the gossip. Like, what stories of joy and suffering will I never hear? What tales of love and loss will be lost to history forever? And, I know gossip is bad and it can hurt people. But for me, gossip made this connection to family, and it made it deeper and stronger and more compassionate. And for that, I am truly thankful. Thank you.